Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Everything Icelandic, an online webinar of the Icelandic National League of North America, the INLNA. I'm your host tonight, Gwen Sigrid Morgan. I'm the president of the INLNA. And we're pleased to see people joining us from all across the country. So we did a little few Zoom reminders. We do have Katrine here as a host, and she'll place people on mute during the presentation, but feel free to type in questions into chat. Just want to say that the INLNA was founded in 1919 by a group of Icelandic immigrants who had a vision of their Icelandic heritage thriving in North America and sharing in the diversity of the Canadian and American culture. The INLNA has chapters from coast to coast, north and south of the 49th parallel. Its mission is to foster connection between members and to Iceland. And our membership, though, is open not only to those of Icelandic heritage, but anyone who loves everything Icelandic. The motto on the INLNA coat of arms is "Strong is the bond, Rum o Sutoi." Yeah. And this year is a special year for Western Icelanders, like all of this of Icelandic descent on this side of the Atlantic, and we are often called the Western Icelanders, as it's 150 years ago in 1875 that New Iceland was founded in Gimli, Manitoba. There are year-long celebrations in Manitoba this year to honor the contributions of the Icelanders over the years. The Gimli Icelandic Canadian Society is the chapter hosting the 2025 INLNA convention. It will be held in Gimli from May 1st to 4th with the theme, "Though the years and the centuries pass." Yeah, here we have our crest and our sign here. And though the years and centuries pass, still the bond is strong, and our great Icelandic cultural heritage thrives. And one way it thrives is through the telling of stories, sagas. And tonight we are so pleased to have with us Professor Ryan Eyford. Professor Eyford will be a keynote speaker at the convention in May, but he's kindly come online for the GICS, the Gimli launch of the convention registration. Sorry, we have.
Anything that I need to put into the kit?
Can you?
Transactions or something.
Well, Gwen, you're muted there.
Oh, I'm muted now. Okay, just muting everybody, including me. All right. I'll start back again just to say that the Gimli Icelandic Canadian Society is the chapter hosting the 2025 INLNA convention. It'll be held in Gimli from May 1st to 4th with the theme, "Though the years and centuries pass." And you can see it written in Icelandic, but I'm not going to try and pronounce it. But even though these years and centuries pass, still the bond is strong and our great Icelandic cultural heritage thrives. So in one way it thrives is through the telling of stories and sagas. And tonight we're pleased to have with us Professor Ryan Eyford. Professor Eyford is a keynote speaker, or will be a keynote speaker at the convention, and he's kindly come online for the GICS, the Gimli chapter's launch of the convention registration, which opened yesterday online. And we'll have a link for you at the end of the webinar. Ryan Eyford is a history professor at the University of Winnipeg, where he offers courses on Indigenous peoples and Métis peoples in Canada. And his research interests are Indigenous settler relations, migration, and Iceland. So Professor Eyford's done extensive research on the Icelandic settlement and written a book called White Settler Reserve, New Iceland and the Colonization of the West. And I can highly recommend this book. It has a lot of detail, And its details capture the personal hopes and dreams and challenges of the people and the families who came in 1875. And it brings the story alive for us. It also provides an in-depth analysis on the political forces and governmental policies that shaped the lives of those early settlers and the local Indigenous and Métis people. So with no further ado, let's welcome Professor Ryan Eyford.
Thank you very much, Gwen, for the invitation, and thank you for that kind introduction. I just want to make sure. Can you hear me? Okay. Can okay. Very good. All right. Well, good evening, friends and relatives. At least one close relative. I can see my cousin Heather. Hello, Heather. So nice to be here with you. Thanks for coming out on this, what is a very cold night here in Manitoba, and also other places. I see there's a blizzard going on in the southern U.S. as well today. So, I'm gonna get this started here. This just a second. Slideshow start. And can everybody see that? Can see that, Gwen? Okay, very good. So usually I'm at home today, but usually I'm at the University of Winnipeg during the day, and that is this is a map of the parishes in the parish of St. James and St. Boniface. This map's from 1875. The red dot is where the University of Winnipeg is located. It's on part of River Lot 78 in the old parish of St. James, which is squarely in the middle of the Red River Métis homeland. And if we look down, if we go straight south from where the University of Winnipeg is located, here is the Assiniboine River. And that river is named for the Nakota people, whose name in Cree is Assiniboine, one of the first peoples of this place, and close relatives of the Dakota, another first peoples of this region. This is a watercolor by a Swiss artist named Peter Rindesbacher from just over 100 or 200 years ago now. Winter fishing on the Assiniboine and Red River, possibly taken, well, it's not taken, it's possibly depicting a scene a little bit further south of where I am right now. And it shows First Nations people, Métis people, and some of the Red River settlers fishing on the river during the wintertime. The rivers are very important to this region, of course, and they were also part of the first treaty in this region. In 1817, Anishinaabe and Cree leaders agreed to share land in the region with displaced farmers from Scotland and Ireland when they signed a treaty with Lord Selkirk. And the area in blue on this map, which comes from the Hudson's Bay Company archives, shows the boundaries of the Treaty of 1817. And you can see over here on the left-hand side are the Dodamag, the clan symbols of the First Nations leaders that signed that treaty. At the top of the map, you can see Lake Winnipeg, and where it says Dead River, that's Netley Creek, which some of you will be familiar with. And over here is Lake Manitoba. A generation later, First Nations leaders signed Treaty 1 with Canada, also known as the Stone Fort Treaty, which was signed right about here where it says Indian Reserve. That's the St. Peter's, the old location of the St. Peter's Reserve. And that treaty laid the groundwork for further immigration into the new province of Manitoba. This map shows the surveys and settlements in the province up to 1874. This is an 1874 map of the province of Manitoba. Here it has the signature of J.S. Dennis, the surveyor general of that time. And up at the top, you see Lake Winnipeg, and it was there that New Iceland would be established a year later. So my talk tonight addresses one aspect of post-1870 immigration to Manitoba, the origins of New Iceland. And as Gwen mentioned, 2025 marks the 150th anniversary of the founding of Nýja Ísland, or New Iceland, the first Icelandic colony in Western Canada. The establishment of New Iceland in 1875 was an important reason why Manitoba became a home to thousands of Icelandic immigrants and their descendants, and remains so today, even though many of you have moved off to Ontario and BC subsequently. The establishment of New Iceland, or this painting, I should say, was created by Icelandic immigrant Árni Sigurðsson to mark the 75th anniversary of New Iceland in 1950. It depicts the arrival of the first group of Icelandic settlers at Willow Point, just south of the present site of Gimli, on October 21st, 1875. Now, Árni was born in 1884. He wasn't actually there, but he tried to reconstruct the event as best he could from the sources that he had, and including the recollections of those who were there. And this painting is now in the collection of the New Iceland Heritage Museum in Gimli. Gwen mentioned my book, White Settler Reserve. I began researching the history of New Iceland just over 25 years ago, and the main product of that research to date is my 2016 book. As a side note here, the ship that's on the cover of the book, this is the Colville, the Hudson's Bay Company steamer that brought the first settlers to Willow Point on that day in 1875. This is the only photograph that I know of. This particular image was taken at Norway House in 1880, but it's the same boat. Tonight, I'm going to share with you a small portion of my findings in that book, focusing on one of the basic questions that I started out with, which was, how did a group of Icelanders, mostly families with young children, end up on the shores of Lake Winnipeg in 1875? It happened. It's a fact of history. It's something that we now take for granted. But when you step back and think about it, it's actually quite a feat, quite an accomplishment for that to have happened. It required the coming together of a particular set of circumstances, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. So the west shore of Lake Winnipeg was not an easy place to get to in 1875 from Iceland, or from Eastern Canada, for that matter. It was much more difficult than this map from the first Canadian immigration.
Kate, that's probably problems with connection.
Can you hear me? Mark can still hear me? Okay. Anybody else? I think Gwen is frozen.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
You sound good to me.
Okay, thank you. All right, so this was a map from the first pamphlet published by the Canadian government, directed toward Icelanders specifically, and it shows the routes from Iceland to Canada and to New Iceland. There's a little bit overly optimistic view of where you can grow wheat in Canada, as you can see from the map. Big parts of the Canadian Shield are identified as wheat zone with grains and grasses. And there's this black line that goes across the country from Quebec to some point in the very badly drawn coastline of BC. And that is labeled as the projected Central Canadian Railway. The railway did not exist in 1875. It was projected. And when the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed a decade later, it followed a much more southerly route than indicated on this map. It took the first New Iceland settlers a month to travel from Toronto to New Iceland, and they did so via Minnesota and Dakota Territory in a journey that involved rail, lake steamboat, rail again, a river paddle wheel boat, and finally flat bottom barges and York boats towed by the Colville, as depicted in Árni Sigurdsson's painting. It was not an easy or comfortable trip. So how did it happen? Was it that people ended up in the middle of North America, who originated in Iceland? I'll explain 4 circumstances that led to this unexpected outcome. The first of these circumstances was that reserving blocks of land for groups of immigrants was an established part of Canadian immigration and colonization policy. This policy aimed to use the incentive of cheap or free lands to encourage private investment in immigration. It was likely adopted on the advice of Gilbert Malcolm Sproat, who's depicted here in the top left corner, who was an immigration agent for British Columbia. His ideas were derived from the way railroad companies in the US managed their government grant lands. So the US government gave lands to railroad companies to help subsidize the cost of their construction. They would sell the lands and use the revenue to pay for the construction of the line. And there would sometimes be separate colonization companies that would manage the land side of the railroad business. And this is the model that Sproat recommended to the Canadian government in 1872. And I have one of his letters here in the top right, and then some of the things he included in the letter. This is a part of a newspaper produced by the Northern Pacific Railroad, promoting something called the Red River Colony, very different from a different Red River Colony in Minnesota, near the Red River and near the White Earth Reservation, if you're familiar with that part of Minnesota. So the map shows how the colony lands were connected to the rail network, and they hoped to bring out immigrants to settle on there. So colonization reserves were first introduced to Manitoba in 1872, and over the course of a decade, more than 1 million acres were reserved for various European immigrant groups. The best known of these are the reserves for the Mennonites from Russia in the southeast and south central part of the province, the east and west reserves, and also the Icelandic reserve, which is highlighted here. But as you can see, all these other areas colored in orange, there were other reserves as well. The idea behind this was that a private organization, which could be a company or a community group, would help pay for the transportation and settlement of the immigrants. In return, that private group would get the option of buying lands within the reserved tract at a reduced rate. They could then sell those lands for a profit to the existing settlers or to new immigrants. This never actually worked in practice. The private promoters often had no money and could not recruit immigrants, so they ended up losing their reserves in most cases. In the Icelandic case, there were immigrants, but no private backer willing to subsidize their colony. The government tried to get the Hudson's Bay Company to act as a private investor, guaranteeing loans to the Icelanders, but the HBC wanted no part of this. They were happy to supply the colony using government money, but did not want to be a guarantor to the settlement. So New Iceland instead became a government-sponsored colonization project. So circumstance number 1, New Iceland was part of an established government policy, creating reserves for immigrants. The second circumstance is transportation and communication. In the 1870s, Iceland was becoming more integrated into the immigration transportation network of the North Atlantic. This photo from the 1880s shows the Allen Line steamer Parisian at Quebec, and you can see the old Quebec in the the background there in the citadel of Quebec. This is how thousands of Icelanders entered North America during the period of mass Icelandic immigration from 1870 to 1914. Whether they intended to settle in Canada or the United States, oftentimes they arrived first at Quebec. The genealogists here will recognize the names of some of the Allen Line ships on this 1873 ad from the Glasgow Herald. The Manitoban and St. Patrick brought 115 and 351 Icelanders to Ontario in 1873 and 1874, respectively. Many of those immigrants went on to become the first settlers of New Iceland. So there were regular sailings between Glasgow and Quebec, and people went from Iceland usually to Scotland, where they caught the transatlantic steamer. The Scottish-Canadian Allen Line established ties with a shipping agent in Iceland named Guðmundur Lambertsson. Lambertsson discussed the growing interest in immigration in Iceland with the Allens and their agents, and the Allens in turn informed the Canadian provincial and federal immigration agents working in the United Kingdom and Scandinavia. The Allen Line received subsidies called passenger warrants from the government for booking immigrants to Canada, and individual agents received bonuses. Once New Iceland was established, Canada sent immigration agents directly to Iceland to distribute promotional literature and organize subsidized transport in collaboration with the shipping agents. So the agents working for the government and agents working for the shipping companies worked very closely together. And the Allens were particularly close with the Canadian government. They got into trouble in 1873 over the contract to build the Pacific Railway, but they remained a very important and influential family. So there was this whole network of transportation that Icelanders were being funneled into. That is the second circumstance that promoted Icelandic migration to Canada in general and to New Iceland in particular. I've called the third circumstance perception and influence, and it relates more to the actions of individuals. I'll tell you about some of the key decision makers and how they were connected to one another. This is John Lowe, who was the senior civil servant responsible for immigration. In 1873, after hearing from the Allens and Canadian immigration agents that Icelanders were eager to emigrate, Lowe sent the letter on the right to Colonel Fletcher, who was the aide-de-camp to the Governor General, Lord Dufferin. And in the letter, if you can decipher Lowe's chicken scratch, he asks if Canada should recruit Icelanders as settlers. And there's a bit of a protocol going on here because he wrote to Fletcher rather than writing to the Governor General directly. But when I found this letter in the archives and flipped it over, I found Dufferin's response on the back. So Lord Dufferin, the Governor General, he responded positively, saying that, yes, the Icelanders would make good settlers. They resembled Norwegians, is what Dufferin said, and they were not religious fanatics. So he, based on these endorsements, Lord Dufferin said, yes, it's a good idea. And some of you will know that Lord Dufferin was considered an expert on Iceland because he had visited in the 1850s and wrote a book about his trip, which was widely read by Canadians at the time. It was one of the sources, their sources of information about Icelanders, was what Dufferin had said in his book, Letters from High Latitudes. The racial thinking of the period that ascribed to by Dufferin and Lowe and others in positions of power considered the Icelanders to be close relatives of the Anglo-Saxons and thus desirable immigrants. That's the term they used, desirable. These people are desirable because they have the right qualities. With Dufferin's endorsement, Lowe instructed his agents to recruit Icelandic immigrants and promised them land in the Northwest. So that mobilized all the subsidies that the state had to offer to Icelandic immigrants. But as many of you know, the first two large groups did not actually go to the northwest. They went to Ontario. The first group in 1873 going to Muskoka, and the second in 1874 going to Kinmount. Ontario had recruited them because they wanted to settle them in the Shield Country on the north, in the southern part of the province, or the edge of the Shield Country, I should say, which they were then promoting as a new area for agricultural development. And many of you will be quite familiar with the story of the Icelanders at Kinmount, where they suffered terrible privations, and many, especially children, died, and they were in very difficult circumstances. And at that point, the provincial government became hostile to them, and told the federal government that they had nothing to do with these people, and they had not been responsible for introducing them to this place, which was a total fabrication. Ontario brought them there, and then when they were no longer needed for their labor, were told that they were not welcome and they needed to move somewhere else. And Ontario blamed the federal government, a classic case of federal-provincial squabbling. At this stage, John Taylor, a Baptist lay preacher and Bible salesman, stepped in to advocate on the Icelanders' behalf. He wrote to Lord Dufferin, whose office directed the letter to John Lowe in the immigration branch, and Lowe and his colleagues in the Department of the Interior decided to sponsor an Icelandic delegation to select lands in Manitoba and the Northwest Territories for a colony. So they said, go to Manitoba, pick lands, and we'll reserve them for you. The delegation was led by Taylor, who later used his political connections to the Liberal Party, which was in power at the time, to secure a position as Icelandic agent that he held until his death in 1884. John Taylor didn't actually speak Icelandic and doesn't appear to have known much of anything about Icelanders. And so he needed an intermediary, somebody to help him actually communicate with the people. And that person was 23-year-old Sigtryggur Jónsson, who stepped into that role, just a young person at the time. He was the first Icelander to settle in Canada. He arrived in 1872. And he knew English before he arrived, and so he was very articulate, and he was and could write very well in English, and became a go-between between the Icelanders at Kinmount and the Ontario government first, and then also with the federal government once Taylor became involved. Sigtryggur became one of the delegates to Manitoba, along with Einar Jónsson, who's not related to him closely, and Kristján Jónsson, and then also joined by some Icelanders from Wisconsin, Sigurður Kristoffersson in particular. So they traveled to Manitoba, and they selected the lands on the southwest shore of Lake Winnipeg that became New Iceland. Sigtryggur was the principal author of the delegation's report, and it was later published in the immigration pamphlet Nýja Ísland Canada, which was distributed in Iceland by Sigtryggur himself. Because after New Iceland was established, in the fall of 1875, Jónsson was sent to Iceland as a Canadian emigration agent, along with a Danish-American librarian named W.C. Krieger. And they spent 1875 into 1876 organizing the next group of immigrants, who many of you will know is called the Large Group, which was really the biggest influx into New Iceland during its earliest years. So this third circumstance is these individuals and the connections between them that supported Icelandic immigration and the value of Icelanders as settlers in Canada. Jónsson, Taylor, Lowe, and Lord Dufferin among them. All of this, reserved land, subsidized recruitment and transportation, the actions of key individuals who had positive views about Icelanders, would not have mattered if the Icelanders did not want to settle together as a group. In the group meetings in Ontario and Wisconsin that followed the journey of the delegation to Manitoba, the Icelanders there confirmed their desire to form what they called a united Icelandic colony that would bring together people who were living in at that time in various parts of Ontario and Wisconsin. Not everybody had stayed at Kinmount. Some people had moved elsewhere in the province in search of work. So it was this desire to found a united colony that led most of the immigrants living in Ontario and some living in Wisconsin to take up the Canadian government's offer of assistance and make the long journey to the shores of Lake Winnipeg almost 150 years ago. And this is an image that I'm sure many of you have seen before of the Icelanders at Sarnia getting ready to board the steamer Ontario, which would take them to, eventually they go to Duluth, and then at Duluth, they took the railroad to the Red River, and then the paddle wheel boat to Fort Garry, and then on to, not Lake Manitoba, as they say here, but actually Lake Winnipeg. So that was the circumstance that those were the circumstances that led to the establishment of New Iceland. Just in concluding, I want to, and before opening up for questions, I want to briefly address the question of why the Icelandic delegation chose the southwest shore of Lake Winnipeg as the site for their reserve. Both in the 1870s and later, critics charged that the delegation made a terrible error. The land was generally poor, prone to flooding, and far from markets, the critics claimed. Why did the delegation choose? Why didn't they choose the rich prairie lands to the south? Well, in answering that question, context matters a lot. And you have to look at the specific circumstances of the time. And if you think back to that map that I showed you with the projected line of the Central Canadian Railway, here's a detail from that map. And you can see, so here's Manitoba as it was in 1875, and there's the line that represents the railway passing just to the south and to the west of New Iceland. This is one of the main reasons that the delegation gave for their choice. They mentioned that as the line is being constructed, Icelanders will find work on the construction teams, but once it's done, they will have ready access to markets. They mentioned that they could ship goods by water from Lake Winnipeg down the Red River to the place where the railway crossed the Red River. Initially, that was called the Crossing, but later it became the town of Selkirk, Manitoba. And then they envisioned that the settlement would grow to include the area to the west, so that it was right on the line of the railway. Some of you may know that part of the reason that the railway did not cross the Red at Selkirk, but instead of Winnipeg, was part of a massive set of subsidies that the city of Winnipeg offered the CPR syndicate to move the line north and have it go through the city of Winnipeg instead of crossing at Selkirk and going up through the Interlake. But that was why, or part of the reason why they picked that location. They envisioned shipping the colony's produce, fish, timber, agricultural products by water or by land to the railway. They essentially, what they did was they selected the largest tract of land available that was both close to the existing settlements and the projected line of the railway. In 1875, the delegation could not have foreseen that the Canadian Pacific Railway would be rerouted to the Southern Plains. And New Iceland became one of the many communities in the Northwest that were adversely impacted by that decision. People moved into the Saskatchewan River country in anticipation of the railway passing through there, and then only to have the line changed. By choosing a reserve on the southern prairies in 1875, the Icelandic delegation would have placed the colony far away from markets in a location where water transport was not possible and where there was little timber for building and/or fuel. There wasn't actually a lot of settlement on the prairies at this time because for that reason that wood was the main fuel and there was no trees to be had nearby. It wasn't until the railway actually passed through that the colonization on the prairies intensified. So the prairies only appear to be the better option with the benefit of hindsight. In 1875, this seemed like the right place to be. And in fact, the delegation was directed there by the Dominion Commissioner of Lands in Winnipeg, Donald Codd, who said this is the place where you should locate. So that is why New Iceland is where it is, why it was created where it is. There's a lot more that could be said on this subject. Gwen mentioned that I'll also be speaking at the convention in May, and and on that occasion, I'll be saying more about the people themselves, the first group of settlers, the families who arrived and tried to make a new home for themselves in New Iceland in October of 1875. So I think that's all I'm going to tell you for now. Thanks for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Gwen, you're still muted there if you're trying to.
There we go. Yeah, I'm having all these things with my computer tonight. So my froze upstairs. So I've run downstairs to get on the computer down here. Thank you very much, Ryan. It's interesting. I'm glad you've given the teaser that you're going to talk about the settlers. So I just have one quick question, though, and without giving it all away, I was wondering, did the settlers come from a variety of backgrounds, or was it really just the lowest, I mean, you might say the lowest class in Iceland, or the poorest class in Iceland? Or was there a variety? Because I'm struck that Jonasson was so well educated.
Yeah, I would say they're not generally not the poorest people. Especially at that time, they were typically tenant farmers. So they typically didn't own land themselves, but they owned livestock. And one thing I didn't mention was that having the possibility of shipping livestock to the UK was absolutely critical to facilitating emigration because the people's main asset was their livestock. And in 1873, the people actually traveled to Scotland with their horses in conditions that they were not very pleased about. They were found that they were very angry with the shipping agent for sending them on that boat in unsanitary conditions. But throughout the immigration period, always trying to find a market for Icelandic livestock was very much connected to immigration because that was the people's main asset.
And they could bring their so along with books that we hear that were so important, they brought their livestock if they could. That's really neat. I also wanted to ask, and we'll look in chat. People can put questions. Oh, here's a question from Lisa Jonasson Maloney. She says, "Hi, Ryan. Can you talk a bit about the costs involved with the settlers immigrating to Canada and what that cost would be in today's values?"
Oh gosh, yeah, I'd have to have to think about today's values, but the general story, Lisa, is that the they didn't have um, they didn't have much cash at all, and a lot of their, like I say, their stock was actually livestock, and in some cases they left their stock in the care of other people to sell them and then send them the money later on. You know, many of the first settlers of New Iceland were very much reliant on the kinds of subsidies that the Canadian government provided to get them to Canada and then to get them to Winnipeg and then to New Iceland. So they didn't have a lot of cash to begin with, and once they were in New Iceland, um, many of the settlers took loans from the Canadian government to be able to get established, and eventually there was quite a substantial amount that it was $100,000 in 1870 dollars was loaned to the settlement. And that was in the crisis of the smallpox epidemic that started in 1876, but to help the settlers survive that and get established.
Thank you, Ryan. Angela asked a question. Were they bringing sheep? Was part of the livestock sheep or?
The sheep were shipped to the UK, but not to Canada at that time. They went to market, and initially it was horses that were of interest in Scotland to work as pit ponies in mines. So that was the main commodity being shipped.
Great. Okay, so Sean is asking, is all this in your book? And wondering about the presentation. Is it in your book? And then another question, which I've just lost here. Why didn't the ships go for a couple days longer and go someplace warmer?
Good question, Don. So first one, yes, that I've been summarizing parts of my book, which you can find, of course, at Turgeson's in Gimli. I see Lorna is on the call as well. But the interesting thing that if the early period of Icelandic immigration, there was a lot of interest in going to Brazil. A lot of people in the north of Iceland signed up for going to Brazil, and they would have gone if the shipping had worked out. Just basically, they couldn't figure out how to make the logistics work. And so in the end, only a small number of people went to Brazil. And there was a family called Sundal that I think stayed there. And then there was a Narveson family that later moved and lived in Saskatchewan. But they did have that idea, Sean. They wanted to move to Brazil, but ended up in Gimli.
That's great. I know you're going to talk about this more, Ryan, and when you're at the convention. But I want to ask, how important were the Indigenous people to the survival of those settlers? I'm thinking maybe in that first year or the first years.
The first year, I showed you the painting of Agne Sigurdsson's from where he's imagining what it was like. But one of the things that's missing there is that there were Indigenous people there right at that time. Initially, they were carrying the mail between New Iceland and St. Peter's, the Indigenous settlement on the Red River, and helped to bring supplies to the colony. Some of you will know that in the first winter, things were so bad that people got scurvy in New Iceland, and so there was that connection between St. Peter's and Gimli was sort of like a lifeline. Another thing that actually comes to mind is Joseph Monkman, who was he had assisted the Icelandic delegation, and when they went to the southwest shore of Lake Winnipeg, and then later on, he gave some of the settlers advice on where to go fishing based on his experience. So it was very much trial and error for the Icelanders learning how to fish on the lake, and Monkman was one of the people who gave them advice on how to how to do it and how to become lake fishermen. And so that was really critical for their survival early on. And eventually, fishing, an export-oriented fishery, became the basis of the economy for New Iceland.
Wow, thank you. So pretty important. I'll look in here. Another question that I had from reading the book is, which you can just touch upon. I know at the convention you'll speak more to it, but you wrote about the difference between Canada and the US in regards to women settlers. And I found that really, really interesting. Can you say just a little bit more about the differences for women who were trying to come to Canada or US, and maybe how that impact their choice?
Yeah, so there were some households headed by women that came to New Iceland, and some women were homesteaders in New Iceland. And this was allowed in Canadian law if a woman was the sole head of household and she had children to support. But if a woman was single, or she had no children, she could not claim a homestead in her own right. And that was different in the United States. In the United States, women could claim homesteads. So it may be unexpected, but that was the case. There's a great book about this by Sarah Carter called Imperial Plots, about women homesteaders, and she compares the Canadian and the U.S. sides. But there were definitely female homesteaders in New Iceland. And one of the things that I suspect, but I couldn't really figure out for sure, was whether women could vote in New Iceland's municipal system. I think that they could, because the Constitution of New Iceland uses the term maður to refer to an elector, person, whereas they use the word karlmaður, man, to refer to those who are required to do statute labor on roads. So there's that distinction, and I suspect that as long as a woman was a householder in New Iceland, she could vote for the colony elections. But was never able to definitively prove that based on the records that I was able to find.
Very interesting. This just one last question. Just from reading your book and a little bit I've studied, I've been impressed by how much the Icelander settlers moved around from United States to Canada. Even the poet Stephen G. Stephenson first came to Wisconsin, and then he ended up in Saskatchewan. Again, what this might go into your talk, so we might hear more about this in the convention, but what pushed settlers to move from place to place?
That's a great question. And, if we think about New Iceland, why did people leave initially and go to, they went there in 1875, and then 1878, 79, 80, they left, some of them for North Dakota. Many of those people had suffered terrible personal tragedies in those years. They had lost family members, they had lost children in New Iceland, and had really difficult circumstances. And it was around 1880 and 81, there was devastating flooding in New Iceland that even for the people who were most committed, some of them lost everything and they had to move and start over. So at that time, some of the New Iceland settlers moved to southwestern Manitoba on the prairies and established the Argyll Icelandic settlement. So in that case, it was kind of out of necessity, in that their lands had been flooded out, and so they had to move. Otherwise, people moved, say, from North Dakota to Saskatchewan and Alberta. Oftentimes, it was to give the next generation the opportunity to acquire land. So if you imagine somebody homesteading in North Dakota, they have a homestead, then the area around them fills up. Then they have a family of 5 or 6 kids. They want to establish them on the land, but there's not enough land in the vicinity of their settlement. So they say, well, I can go to Saskatchewan and we can claim several homesteads and fatten a big or go to Markerville. And so that's what you see, is you see people who move from one region to another, and in part for the transition between generations, to provide land to the next generation. Partly it's also looking for new opportunities. Many people who worked in the fishery on Lake Winnipeg, they moved to the Pacific coast and moved to Blaine and Bellingham and got involved in the fishery on the Pacific Ocean. Using their skills as fishermen and for in that different context. So, looking for opportunities and elsewhere.
Yeah. Thank you. And we have in chat here from Lauren. He says, one of my AFAs on his third trip to North America was headed to California, but then got sidelined to NASA. Is that how you say it?
Mesa.
NASA. And then another on my mom's side made it to Portland, worked on Columbia for the rest of his life. So some of them made it a bit south, and some went to Port Roberts, just south of Vancouver, for the fishing and fish processing. So yeah, people were moving for opportunities, and this great wish to have the next generation, their children, their grandchildren do well, do better. And I think that's the hope of really immigrants today who come also. So I want to say thank you very, very much. Ryan, thank you for coming on here. I have here Katrina showing the slide of Ryan's book, which is available online and at Turgeson's in Gimli, which you can also order through online. White Settler Reserve, New Iceland, and the Colonization of the Canadian West, which was really, really a fascinating book. I learned a lot, really interesting stuff about the reserve system. And we'll learn again more about that in the convention. And then the next slide, Kate, we just wanted to say that we did, the INLNA made a calendar for this year called New Beginnings, and you can see this beautiful painting on the front, and it is on sale in local chapters and online for the INLNA at this link. And then we just want to remind people again that the Gimli Icelandic Canadian Society has opened up registration for the INLNA convention. This is the logo that's been made, and you can go online now and register. They've done a lot of work in making it really user-friendly. So I just wanted to say again, if you want to close that down, Kate. Thank you very much. Yeah, I just wanted to say again, Ryan, thank you so much for coming on and doing this webinar. It will be recorded. We'll try and take out some of those glitches, make it a little more polished, but it is as it is. And Katrine has put the link in the chat for if you are inspired right now and want to go register. The link also includes hotel registration at the Lakeview Gimli Resort, where the convention will be held. Very good rates. So really, really accessible. So thank you very, very much, Ryan, and thank you everyone here for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you at the convention in May.
Thank you, Gwen.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah.